Hello and welcome to this edition of Research Thursday. I'm your host, Dr. Richard Harris, and this is a 5-minute-ish or less hot take on some current-ish research. And so this study looked at food insecurity and obesity trends from 2000 to 2015. I thought this was a really interesting article because it looks at, do people basically have access to healthy food? And of the people who have access to healthy food, what is the prevalence of obesity there? And so that's how they define food insecurity. Is food insecurity exists whenever the availability of nutritionally adequate and safe foods, or the ability to acquire acceptable foods in society and socially acceptable ways, is limited or uncertain. So basically, people do not have access to healthy foods. And sometimes these places are called food deserts, or that's what they've been called in the past, but this is what the study meant. So in 2018, on average, 11.1% of households had reported that there was some food insecurity. Food insecurity is associated with diabetes, poor cardiovascular disease, and multiple chronic diseases. It's also very correlated with obesity. And then we also find out that healthcare spending is much higher in areas where there is food insecurity. So this study looked at using BMI and waist circumference as a measure for total body fat, as a surrogate measure for that. So let's dive into what they actually found. So what they found was that there was a greater proportion of obesity in the food insecure group. And so overall, there was 41.5% obesity in the food insecure group versus food secure, 33.5. Either way, that's still pretty high. And we know the obesity rate is climbing above 40% in a lot of states now. And in the food insecure group, there were more people at higher risk. So they had higher waist circumference, higher BMI, and that was about a 53% different in the food insecure group versus 50% in the food insecure. Still pretty high. So that's still saying that there's a large portion of the population at high risk for developing obesity and obesity-related complications. So what was the overall estimated prevalence of food insecurity in the 2015 to 2016 cycle? It was 18.2%, very high. Food insecurity was highest in obesity overall. That was 22.6%. So we're seeing that the obese individuals have the highest amount of food insecurity, and this logically makes sense. We're saying this group of individuals who don't have access to healthy food, what are they eating? A lot of processed food, a lot of fast food, a lot of junk food, and they're getting a lot of calories, but as we've talked about, there's a big deficiency in nutrients. And then also, if you looked at high-risk groups, there was a 19.8% food insecurity in those high-risk, those groups that had higher waist circumference, versus 16.2% in the groups that did not. And then you could even break it down even further when they looked at Hispanic and African American populations. So the food insecurity increased among the obese population up to 29% of black obese people said they were food insecure. They did not have access to healthy foods. And then Hispanics, it was 35%. And that's enormous. And the implications of that are huge for how we treat obesity. And, you know, I've been called fat phobic and that I'm fat shaming. I'm really not. I'm a doctor. My job is to give you all the information and try to help you be as healthy as possible and mitigate risk. I am a health risk mitigation expert. That's the way I approach medicine. That's part of my job. The other part is, if you do have a health issue, how do we holistically treat that? How do we get you as close to balanced as we can? Those are my two jobs. And we know obesity is correlated to all different kinds of things: cancer, diabetes, heart disease, Alzheimer's, increased infections, So it is my job to inform people of this and to try to help them mitigate this disease causing and disease risk factor. And so if you look at the conventional approach, they're just telling people to eat less and exercise more. Well, if 35% of a certain population does not have access to healthy food, that's a huge amount of people telling them to eat less. They're like, well, I don't have access to food. I'm literally just trying to survive. And Dr. Mark Hyman points this out really well in his book, Food Fix, about how part of fixing the obesity epidemic is by making sure that we all have access to healthy food, fresh fruit, vegetables, sustainably raised meats, anti-inflammatory meats and foods that aren't fed grain and soy products and all that stuff, but are eating what nature intended them to eat. And his book, Food Fix, does an amazing job of outlining solutions on how we attack this problem from a socioeconomic perspective, because we absolutely need to. If people do not have access to healthy foods, we need to make sure we can get everyone access to healthy foods. That should be a right, that you have access to healthy foods, to foods that will sustain you. And there have been other studies that have been shown that you can decrease costs, medical spending dramatically just by giving people access to healthy foods. The costs went down dramatically. So this is just another in a long line of studies showing that in order to help the health of this nation, that we are going to have to do some things socioeconomically to make sure that we can provide clean, healthy food for everyone. Thank you, and God bless.